The ghosts of a divided peninsula. To understand the tragedy of the Korean War, one must first look at a map from the summer of 1945. For nearly 40 years, the Korean peninsula had been swallowed by the Japanese Empire, its culture suppressed and its people conscripted into a war effort not of their making. But as the sun set on Imperial Japan, a vacuum was left in its wake. A vacuum that the world's two burgeoning superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were eager to fill. The decision that would define the next century of Asian geopolitics was made not by Koreans, but by two American colonels in a midnight session at the Pentagon. Armed with only a National Geographic map and a ticking clock, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel looked for a way to divide the peninsula into zones of occupation. They chose the 38th parallel, an arbitrary line of latitude that sliced through ancient provinces and family lineages. It was meant to be a temporary administrative boundary to facilitate the Japanese surrender, but in the heat of the emerging Cold War, temporary lines have a habit of becoming permanent scars. The Soviets surprisingly agreed to this division, halting their rapid southward advance at the parallel. In that moment, the fate of millions was sealed. The Korean people, who had endured decades of colonial rule, awoke to find their liberation replaced by a new kind of captivity. The peninsula was no longer a sovereign entity. It had become a laboratory for the competing ideologies of the West and the East. The northern half fell under the influence of the Red Army, while the southern half was occupied by American forces. This was the birth of a dual reality: two separate administrations, two different economic visions, and two irreconcilable dreams for the future of a unified Korea. The 38th parallel was not just a line on a map, it was the first crack in the foundation of the post-war world, a fault line, where the tectonic plates of capitalism and communism would inevitably grind against one another until the earth finally broke. The architect and the exile. As the late 1942 dawned, the administrative zones solidified into rival states, each led by a man who viewed himself as the sole legitimate savior of the Korean people. In the north, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung, a former guerrilla fighter, who had spent years in the Soviet Union and China battling the Japanese. Kim was young, charismatic, and deeply committed to a Marxist-Leninist vision tempered by a fierce, burgeoning nationalism. He was a product of the Soviet military machine, a man who understood that power flowed from the barrel of a gun and the discipline of a centralized state. In the South, the United States eventually backed Syngman Rhee, an elderly Harvard-educated exile who had spent decades in America lobbying for Korean independence. Rhee was a staunch anti-communist, a man whose stubbornness was as legendary as his resilience. These two leaders represented the polarized extremes of the global ideological struggle. Both Kim and Rhee were nationalists first, but their visions for a unified Korea were mutually exclusive. By 1948, the hope for a UN-sponsored election to unify the country had evaporated. Instead, two separate governments were declared: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in Pyongyang and the Republic of Korea in Seoul. The tragedy of this period was the systemic elimination of the middle ground. Moderate politicians who sought a third way were assassinated or silenced. In the South, Rhee's government brutally suppressed leftist uprisings, most notably on Jeju Island, where thousands were killed in the name of stability. In the North, Kim consolidated power by purging rivals and establishing a cult of personality that would endure for generations. The border became a site of increasing friction, no longer a mere administrative line but a militarized frontier. Both leaders begged their respective patrons for the weapons and the permission to reunify the country by force. For a time, the superpowers hesitated, fearing a global conflagration. But the ideological hardening was complete. The two Koreas were now two loaded pistols aimed at each other's hearts, waiting for the finger that would pull the trigger. The global chessboard, the Korean conflict, cannot be viewed in isolation. It was a critical piece in a much larger global game of chess played between Moscow and Washington. In 1949, two seismic events shifted the balance of power and emboldened the communist bloc. First, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, shattering the American nuclear monopoly. Second, Mao Zedong's Communist Party emerged victorious in the Chinese Civil War, driving the nationalists to Taiwan. Suddenly, the world looked very different to Joseph Stalin. The Red Wave seemed unstoppable in Asia. Initially, Stalin had been cautious. denying Kim Il-sung's repeated requests for an invasion of the South, fearing that American intervention would spark a Third World War that the Soviets were not yet ready to fight. However, the American response, or lack thereof, to the fall of China suggested a wavering commitment to mainland Asia. This perception was reinforced by the January 1950 speech by U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who outlined a defensive perimeter in the Pacific that excluded both Taiwan and the Korean peninsula. To Stalin and Kim, this looked like a green light. In April 1950, Kim traveled to Moscow, where Stalin finally gave his blessing for an invasion, provided that Mao Zedong also approved. Stalin was a master of cynical geopolitics. He saw a war in Korea as a way to pin down American resources in Asia away from the vital theater of Europe, while letting the Koreans and potentially the Chinese do the fighting. Mao, newly victorious and eager to secure his borders and repay Kim for Korean help during the Chinese Civil War, pledged his support. The North Korean People's Army was transformed with Soviet T-34 tanks, heavy artillery, and Yak fighter planes. While the Americans provided the South with only light arms and no tanks, fearing Rhee might use them to invade the North was being forged into a modern mechanized strike force. The international stage was set, the scripts were written in secret cables between Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang, and the clock was ticking toward a June morning that would change the world forever. The shadows of war. By the spring of 1950, the 38th parallel had become one of the most dangerous places on Earth. It was not a border in the traditional sense, but a continuous zone of low-intensity conflict. Thousands of soldiers on both sides had already died in skirmishes, raids, and artillery duels long before the official start of the war. These border incidents were often instigated by both sides as Rhee and Kim tested each other's resolve and tried to provoke their superpowers into a larger commitment. However, beneath the surface of these skirmishes, a massive disparity was growing. The North Korean People's Army, or NKPA, was becoming a professional military force, bolstered by thousands of battle-hardened veterans returning from the Chinese Civil War. These men brought with them a level of combat experience that the South Korean constabulary simply did not possess. Meanwhile, the United States had largely withdrawn its combat troops, leaving behind only a small group of military advisors known as KMAG. The Truman administration was focused on the Marshall Plan in Europe and domestic belt-tightening, believing that the threat of the atomic bomb would deter any major communist aggression. This was a catastrophic miscalculation of intelligence. Reports of North Korean troop movements and the massing of armor near the border were dismissed by many in Washington as mere posturing or saber-rattling. In Seoul, the government was plagued by economic instability and political unrest, making it look like a ripe fruit ready to fall with a single shake of the tree. Kim Il-sung was convinced that a swift, decisive strike would cause the Rhee regime to collapse instantly, and that the southern populace would rise up in a pro-communist revolution. He believed the war would be over in weeks before the Americans could even mobilize a response. The tragedy of the Korean War was not just in the fighting, but in the profound misunderstandings each side had of the other. The North underestimated American resolve, and the West underestimated the North's capability and Stalin's willingness to risk a proxy war. The spark and the long shadow in the pre-dawn darkness of the 25th of June 1950, the silence along the 38th parallel was shattered by the roar of heavy artillery. Under the cover of a summer monsoon, over 90,000 North Korean troops, spearheaded by the formidable T-34 tanks, poured across the border. This was not a border skirmish. It was a full-scale invasion executed with Soviet-style blitzkrieg precision. The South Korean forces, lacking anti-tank weapons and caught in a state of unreadiness, were decimated in the opening hours. By the time the news reached Washington, where it was still Saturday night, the North Koreans were already driving towards Seoul. The invasion forced the hand of President Harry Truman. He realized that if the United States failed to act, the credibility of the newly formed United Nations would vanish, and the containment policy against communism would be exposed as a hollow promise. Within days, the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for the assistance of member states to repel the attack, a move made possible only because the Soviets were boycotting the council at the time. The Korean War had begun, but it was a war that would never truly end. It would drag on for 3 bloody years, involving millions of soldiers from dozens of nations, including a massive intervention by the People's Republic of China. It would claim nearly 3 million lives, most of them civilians, and leave the peninsula in total ruin. When the guns finally fell silent in July 1953, the armistice line was drawn almost exactly where the original 38th parallel had been. No peace treaty was ever signed. Today, the Korean War remains the forgotten war in the West, yet its legacy is the most visible remnant of the Cold War. The demilitarized zone remains a scarred ribbon of land, a frozen front line where the same tensions that ignited in 1950 still simmer. The war changed America into a global policeman, solidified the division of East and West, and created a cycle of nuclear brinkmanship that haunts the 21st century. Why did it happen? It happened because a local struggle for identity was hijacked by a global struggle for power, leaving a nation divided by a line that refused to fade.